This is something we should all be really familiar with. But when it comes to growing as a Vue developer, a lot of times, most of us are not so lucky as to inherit a brand new code base, right? We usually have things that we're working with that are brand new, or more importantly, managers want us to ship quickly, so we bring in third-party libraries and we wrap stuff up. But there is a question of how we properly manage those dependencies, because any of us who've done this long enough knows that redesigns often happen. And so having to rip out internals and refactor things is something that's common. And so what are some techniques we can do to kind of manage this particular problem? All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the code that we have. So inside of our app, again, this is our standard Vue 3 app. We're using Vue 3 Router here. You'll notice here that we have a lot going on. Basically, we're using Daisy UI from a Tailwind perspective. So that's like the UI library being used. And one of the things that's being used a lot, and one that I think we can all share as a common pain point, is this icon component. And so this is from Daisy Vue, Daisy UI, in fact. This is from Iconify. And so if we look at the number of instances of icon, you can see that it's actually used, it's used quite a lot. And so this might not seem like a big deal at first, but as we know, design requirements do change. And oftentimes they'll come in and they'll want a random one-off, or they'll want something changed about it. And so the question boils around, how do we actually manage those changes and requests? And so let's say, for instance, that a designer has discovered this amazing resource, which if you are not aware of, you should also be aware of. And it's called icons.js.org. And it's basically this collection of free icons across a lot of different ones. And so, for example, if I want to look up mountain icon, it'll give me a bunch from the different libraries. And what's cool about this is that I can pick any one of these. Let's choose this one, for example. And then it'll tell me where it came from. But then it can also let you generate basically the SVG, or in this case, we can actually just click and copy the Vue component, and it'll just populate that for you. And so let's say the designer wants this, because what they want to do is they want to replace this icon that we have in the upper left. They want to replace it with a mountain instead. And so we know for a fact that this icon does not exist inside the Iconify view. And so what you might be originally tempted to do is probably just either dropping the SVG or a custom component just in that one point. But as we know with Enterprise App, things bloat really quickly, things get reused. And so what we want to do is try to, as much as possible, maintain a single source of truth. That way we can centralize everything. And more importantly, when changes are being made or being swapped out, it's a lot easier to refactor, and more importantly, easier to maintain. So how might we do this? So first thing first, I'll go ahead and create a component, the component here inside of the components folder. I usually like to create a dedicated icons folder. So I'll call this icon mountain.vue, and then I'll just paste basically the template that they generated for us earlier. And so you see here, we just have a simple SVG. It has some widths defined as well as a view box. And so overall, it looks fairly straightforward. So I'm just going to go ahead and actually switch the name here, just to icon mountain to simplify it. And so, as I mentioned before, one of the things we want to do is centralize the work that we're doing. Because as we saw when we looked at the icons, there are just so many different variations here. There's a lot of different widths going on, as well as trying to figure out, okay, what exactly are we standardizing on? Especially if we want to start with all icons should start with 20 by 20 size, for example. That would be pretty tricky to do, especially if you're just doing a search and replace. And so the pattern that I generally recommend when it comes to this is known as a vendor wrapper component. And so what that essentially does is it allows us to basically create a wrapper around the UI library components that we're using as a way to basically provide this single source of truth. And so the way that would look is that we would go ahead and create a base icon component. And so I'm going to use a little snippet here that I have. Basically, this is a VS Code snippet. And so just in case anyone's not sure what this is, and it basically allows me to scaffold a single file component basically instantly, like that.
How do you do that SFC shortcut?
The which one?
SFC.
Oh, yes. Oh, cool. I'm glad you asked about this. So when you're in VS Code, if you go to your extensions, so I'll do it the command prompt way, so Command Shift P, and then we'll go to our extensions. Can I just see my extensions? Okay, the way I do it is Command KE, or X, but anyways, it's right here. So Sarah Drasner, who used to be on the Vue core team and now is at Google, she created this thing called Vue VS Code snippets. And so highly recommend it as an extension. And so I actually am one of the maintainers. So it has a bunch of different basically snippets for like things that you like to use. So you can see here that like if you do like okay, let's see, vbase ss, right? So if I come inside here and I'm inside of my view, vbase. So you see here, there's like a bunch of different ones you can choose from, and then it'll just kind of, you can basically customize it. So the thing though is that you can install it, definitely play around with it. But what I really love about the repo is that once you look at it and you find one that you're like, I like that one, I just want to tweak it a little bit. VS Code snippets are actually fairly easy to create on your own, because then you'll just copy it, be like, oh, I don't use Sass, I use less, or PostCSS because I use Tailwind, whatever. Then you don't have to deal with like the boilerplate that comes with it. Okay, so we know a couple of things. We know, one, we want to make sure we migrate all of the icons over, iconify. And so let's go ahead and do that first. So let's search. So we have this import that we're going to grab here. And then we know as well that this is the general structure that we see, at least for the iconify one. And so what's interesting, though, is that you'll see here that in the iconify icon, they use icon in order as like the prop to designate what the name is. But if you use other icon libraries as well, you'll notice that the API for it is different as well. So that's one of the reasons the vendor wrapper icon can be very advantageous. Because for our example with the mountain icon, right? So if I import the icon mountain, for example, what we probably want to do then is we need to do two things. One, we need to set what our default is, and then basically what our override is going to be. So the default is at this point going to be iconify view, because this is obviously where a bulk of our icons are living. So what I like to do generally in this situation is we define a prop here, where we basically have the source be a type of string, and then I default it to the main library that we're actually using. And so in this regard, so here we can say vif right, source is equal to iconify. And then we go ahead and then designate the rest of it. So we can say, okay, how do we want this API to look? Do we want to just call it icon? Or in this case, I do think what I've seen more normally, especially when it comes to icon naming, is just the name itself. So then we can have a name string here, and we'll go ahead and require it. And then we can bind this directly to name as well. And then we can go ahead, and then width and height are also very common as well. So we'll go ahead and also just go ahead and designate those as well. So then default 20, and then we'll just copy this and make that height. And here we have the beginnings of our wrapper icon. Okay? So, of course, the question is, now we need to deal with this icon mountain. How do we deal with this? Now, if we think about this from another perspective, while it's easy to say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to bring icon mountain here, down here, and we're just going to basically like velse. You could do something as simple as that if you really wanted to. However, obviously, when it comes to scale, it's not going to work as well as you think. So what we ultimately want to do is provide the user the ability to basically define their name, and then we're going to dynamically import that as it goes. So the way you do that is there is a helper function in Vue called define async component. And so what that's going to allow you to do is basically define a path that can be brought in, basically based on how it's defined. So what I'm going to do here is then also I'm going to bring in computed as well, because we're going to go ahead and make, first we need to refer to our props, so I'm going to assign it to a variable. And so then we're going to say, so our custom icons, it's going to be a computed value where basically if props.source is equal to, or basically in this case, we can say not equal to iconify. We could even go that far to say that at this point. Then we could say basically return define async component. And then that takes a function that returns basically an import statement of the path. So in this case, it'll be components. I believe I put it in icons. Yep. And then slash. And then I can go ahead and just do the props.name.view. And then otherwise, we just return null. Okay, let's see. So let's see, it's cannot find its corresponding type declarations. That is fine for now because this is dynamically being brought in. Oh, I see what it is. Hang on. Doop. There you go. Yay for syntax highlighting. Okay, so now that you have this, what you can do is Vue has the built-in dynamic component. So now we can basically say, for the component, dynamic component, we're going to make that equivalent to using the is parameter, is prop, to say custom icon. And so what we're going to do now then is we're going to go ahead and find that header that we had. So app.view, header here. So we have this icon here, right, with the target. We no longer want that. What we're going to do instead is we're just going to import our base icon. And so this will go ahead and import that directly right here. Although sometimes it does it incorrectly and as a type. So that's actually a little bit frustrating sometimes. And then I'll say source, I like to say custom, and then the name is going to be icon mountain. And now that we save, you can see, voila, we have our base icon. And so this pattern is incredibly effective for essentially helping you centralize these things. And so I won't go through the process right now of like doing all the replace of the base icon. I'll do that later when we're doing exercises. But so this is the concept of the vendor wrapper. Now, the other technique that I do want to mention here with the base icon is, let me cue the slide here. It's known as the vbind von syntax. So here, typically, you would have, like, again, let's say we wanted to customize the width to like 30 and then the height also to 30. You notice here, one, it's broken partially because on the base icon, I did not define the various props on here directly. So I'll go ahead and just copy this over real quick, just so we can get rid of that error. String is not assignable to number. All right, we'll deal with that later. So what you can do actually is that in the event that you wanted to make this dynamic, right? So let's go ahead and say, for example, that we have a custom source, and then we'll just make this a ref real quick just to demonstrate this. And then we'll call this font awesome. And then we had a const custom name equals ref, and we'll call this upside down mountain. And then we had const custom width, which is a ref of, let's say, 40. Then we have our custom height. So one way you could define this is you could go ahead and come in and then vbind each one of these individually. So this should look familiar to most people. This one, custom height. You could do it like this. However, a lot of times when we're working with dynamic components, you can't always control what attributes are being, especially if you're swapping out components, you're going to be swapping out different properties, different events. And so if you're hard coding them like this, you're going to have basically extra code being passed to your components that don't need to be. And so what you can do instead is this can all actually be shortcutted to this vbind syntax, where you basically have an object. And this is where the thing that we see here would be equivalent to this. And then what's nice about this is you can take this one step further in that if we just assume, again, let's just say props let's see, that's fine. Props object. And then you just basically did the source, the name, and then the width, and the height here. Again, assuming this, width, and height. This whole thing can be swapped down into just props object. And this is important. The reason I wanted to go over this is because this is going to be very common as we go through the rest of the patterns, where we're going to be basically doing vbind on dynamic attributes where we don't know what's being passed. And so we basically need Vue to just spread it out on the component, and we kind of decide what's going on. And so this also, I won't demonstrate this explicitly, but in the event you have multiple like events, right, as well, like mouse down, key up, whatnot, there's an equivalent for, call it the events object, right, where you can just write an object that pairs your events to whatever functions you want to assign them to. So both these are basically what they call the vbind, von object syntax.